This is part 2 of our two-part series on William Duane, the founder and publisher of the Indian World. If you haven't listened to part 1, press pause here and go back and listen to it. We will still be here when you're back. And now for part 2 of William Duane's Republic of Letters. In the last episode, we told you William Duane's origin story. He came to India and worked as an editor for the Bengal Journal. After being arrested on the orders of Governor-General Cornwallis, he lost his job. He then started a new newspaper called the Indian World. We left you in the last episode in that moment in time when William Duane decided to platform the grievances of the East India Company Army's soldiers in the pages of the Indian World. But let us set some context for you. The Indian World, we told you in the last episode, was a conscious world of thought, a republic of letters. But what does that term mean? You see, back in the 18th century, letters were the primary means of long-distance correspondence. However, along with personal communication and endearments, letters amongst intellectuals were often spaces where ideas were exchanged. There was nothing formal about this. People wrote to each other about their ideas, and some historians regard this as a crucial feature of the Age of Enlightenment. In fact, people even in the 1600s were quick to grasp the significance of letters. Vigneul Mahuel, a French monk, once wrote, "Never before has a republic been so large, so populated, so free, and so glorious. It extends across the earth and consists of people of all nations, of every condition, age, and sex. All sorts of living and dead languages are spoken there." The purpose of this republic of letters was never defined. But it led to exchanges of ideas, philosophies, scientific theories, and was marked by a feeling of fraternity across Europe. The philosophies of dead philosophers were resurrected here. Whether someone was interested in botany or geography or navigation or even astronomy, the Republic of Letters provided a space for people to push knowledge forward as a collective effort. But as always, something of this significance got rooted in academic institutions away from rural areas. The Republic of Letters became a space for the elite. By the time printing presses came into the game, the time was ripe for there to be several republics of letters, with each newspaper being a self-contained such space. As Jürgen Habermas tells us in The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, published in 1962, the architecture of the public sphere evolved from coffee houses and salons to the printed word. Print established an arena for public debate, over which the state had no control. Not only were people now cued into the same information contained in a pamphlet or a newsletter, they could discuss it amongst themselves, which had the long-term effect of undermining the power held by traditional royal authority and the church. However, not everyone was as convinced that the printed word was a good thing. Famed essayist Joseph Addison wrote as far back as 1714 that the art of printing could be detrimental and could quite easily spread half-truths, prejudice, and ignorance. Either way, as print technologies became more widespread, newspapers boomed, and often they were just printing the letters they received from people. That was how they got content back then. Employing reporters was to be a 19th century phenomenon. Before that, printers would often offer bribes to diplomats or officials who had access to privileged correspondence to leak letters to printers. In this manner, the newspaper became familiar to people as a place where letters from people with diverging opinions could be given a space. And this is exactly what William Duane wanted his newspaper, the Indian World, to be. So, what was going on in the pages of the Indian world? Famously, letters from a group of lieutenant colonels who identified themselves as Senex, Juvenis, Stratiotes, Subaltern, Antony, and Democritus were published in 1792. Senex attacked the slow promotion system in the company army. He said that without a certain amount of bowing and scraping before senior officers, young officers found it hard to get promoted. Stratiotes attacked the conditions in which troops existed as compared to the conditions of troops who were in the king's army. He was aggrieved that officers could almost never be promoted beyond the rank of colonel, and so younger officers waited for older colonels to kick their respective buckets just so they could get promoted. Antony attacked the patronage systems at work in the king's army. He thought officers were kicked up the military ladder only because of their elite berths, not because they were good officers. Stratiotes wanted men in the company's army to organize themselves in committees, read some sort of union, where they could bargain with their post commanders for what they wanted. All of these complaints, targeted criticisms against officers, and plans to organize a series of unions to represent the company's subaltern personnel, all of this took place in the pages of the world. This is Reality Scribes. I am Vasundhara Sirnath.
And I am Sumit Chaturvedi. We are Indian journalists who in this podcast are telling you the story of the origins of Indian journalism and taking you through the history of Indian society's news and information ecosystems, our news culture, and how these have evolved over years, decades, and centuries.
Duane had allowed and encouraged his paper to be turned into a radical weapon by soldiers who echoed ideas that were considered revolutionary. They wanted to dismantle the patronage system, the very system which undergirded the way the East India Company was born and how it was run. In return, the world had a large number of subscribers from the soldiery. We spoke to Dr. Ritika Prasad to make sense of Duane's actions. Ritika Prasad is an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. She is an historian of the colonial period in South Asia and has a special interest in the social history of technology and how technology impacts people in their everyday lives. Her most recent book project examines the relationship between the newspaper press, the colonial and post-colonial state, and the development of a broader public in India over 2 centuries. We will keep you posted about the release of Ritika's book. Frankly, we can't wait to read it. Would you say that the assessment that Nigel Little has made about William Duane is accurate? Or should we be looking more at the sort of structural things that are going on at the time to understand why or how he did the things that he did with respect to his paper? And by that, I think before that I had talked about how in the Nigel Little book, Duane is somebody who's very influenced by the Irish volunteer movement. He has a lot of appreciation and admiration for people in uniform. He's on this ship where he's making friends with all these officers or officials of the East India Company's military. So when his paper becomes, as Nigel Little says, a republic of letters, where all these military men are airing their grievances, and then splicing that with your argument, which is more about structure and less about how the personality or the character drives this industry or journalism or this field forward. So that's why I asked you about Nigel Little's assessment on Duane.
So the old structure or individual debate, but I think it's a really important one. And Nigel Little's biography is very significant to understanding Duane in a larger global context. And the idea of a transoceanic radical is very important to establishing that this geography of the press is more mobile than our national histories suggest. So that's another important contribution that Nigel Little makes. And it is important to keep in mind because people like Duane and several others do not simply pop into India out of nowhere. So we have to pay attention to what is the broader political and ideological understanding of the press that they come with when they come to India. Having said that, I think I will make two statements. First, I want to refer back to Nigel Little's analysis in which he states that in understanding the Indian context of Duane's work, and I quote from him, he says, the links between editors and malcontent officers in the EIC armies was very important to Duane's broader understanding of journalism. And this points to the big concern at that time, which is control over subordinates, and military subordinates were considered incredibly dangerous. Because all of them did not necessarily have the same stake in this emerging state as colonial officials, EIC officials did. And at the same time, the military has the ability to make a lot of demands because this emerging state is supported by military power. It does not have the kind of administrative structure, and it obviously does not have political representation. So I think Duane, in the Indian context, is also able to put his finger on this tension. And as we can see, others who wrote in, the early model of letters to the editor are also able to locate this tension. And so this does, in a way, link Duane's personal biography with the Indian context, but the Indian context provides him with the ability to understand, how he can represent military grievances as part of an adversarial press position. The second thing is, if we look at Duane's case, it also shows analogies to other cases. One of the things is that, officials were trying to avoid long drawn-out legal battles. And so the threat of deportation is one way to avoid this legal battle. And there were legal precedents for libel prosecutions because Hickey had been prosecuted. So by the time Duane's case came up, he could have been prosecuted, but that was not the way that they wanted to go, which they also effectively gave him a second chance. He was not deported the first time. So there is this model of very stern warnings and multiple violations. And that is partly because a lot of officials argue that a prosecution would entail a discussion of precisely the matters that they were upset about in the first place, a more public discussion. Also, I do think the severity of the crime matters. So Duane's publications were more threatening than some of the other ones, and the attention on him was greater. And they were aware of his antecedents, exactly what Nigel Little emphasizes. So that makes them more concerned. It's not just another editor setting up a new paper asking military men what their gripes are. This is somebody who has a history and ideological framework in which he's operating, that of radicalism, and they don't want that imported into India. So I think Duane is distinct in those ways, but he's not entirely different. Because the global context that Nigel Little emphasizes affects how seriously they take the threat of Duane. But many of the ways through which they deal with him are strategies that we see in other cases. So that is a very long way to say it cannot be an either-or model.
The success of Duane and that of the world was not going to last. The first alarming sign that things were amiss came when Duane's subscribers began to fall. Margarita Barnes, has quoted Duane's statement in her 1940 book, The Indian Press. He reportedly said, "Subscribers to my paper apologized for withdrawing their names. The alternative had been given to them of relinquishing that or the goodwill of persons in power. Tradesmen attached to me by personal regard were compelled to withhold their advertisements. They were told that to advertise with me would be to ensure the loss of custom of the same persons and all their friends. The military, where my most numerous attachments lay, were in like manner attempted, but not with the same effect." According to Duane's biographer Nigel Little, an unnamed source informed him that the stances his paper was taking against the East India Company army had led to governmental strangulation of his business. This was an informal censorship of sorts. By the beginning of 1794, anyone who was radical, pro-French, or pro-revolution was viewed with revulsion by senior officials. Indeed, in 1793, the execution of the French monarch Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette had led to widespread condemnation. Then, Duane printed something libelous about the Wazir of the Nawab of Awadh. Technically, this shouldn't have raised any eyebrows, but it did. The Nawab was a British ally. However, you have to see this allyship in the context of an argument made by historian Christopher Bailey. As the British were claiming the mantle of the legitimate successors of the Mughals in India, they had to show that they were allied with Mughal power or were inheriting it naturally and successfully. This connection with the Mughals was crucial to future British legitimacy and interests. If attacks came from a British corner of India to one of their Indian allies, their claim as the legitimate successors of the Mughals would be weakened. True to form, Duane couldn't care less. For him, a democratic press criticizing the government was a natural right. He would criticize whoever he wanted, even if that was the Wazir of the Nawab of Awadh, which, by extension, kinda meant that he was criticizing the Nawab of Awadh himself. This was the last straw. On May 30th, 1794, John Shore, the new Governor General who had succeeded Cornwallis, issued the order for Duane's deportation. We know what actions John Shore took against Duane because later that year he wrote a letter to Henry Dundas, who was the Secretary of State for War under British Prime Minister William Pitt. In this letter, dated 31st December 1794, Shore wrote, "Our newspapers in Calcutta have of late assumed licentiousness, too dangerous to be permitted in this country. I have ordered one of the editors to be sent to Europe. His name is William Duane. And I think you will agree with me that his conduct did not entitle him to the protection of the company. He addressed a letter to me in terms of intimidation, and as he has long been ordered to return to Europe, he was apprehended and confined to the fort by my directions." In the records and correspondence surrounding the deportation of Duane, 3 motives are mentioned. The first was his libel of the Wazir of Awadh. The second motive mentioned was his support for the French Revolution and spreading the ideas of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was a political philosopher from Duane's time, who, amongst other things, thought that hereditary monarchy was an absurd concept and that representative government was a good one. We have to understand that in the 1700s, these ideas, which today we would identify as democratic, were very radical. By amplifying the ideas of Thomas Paine, Duane was identifying himself as a radical. The third motive stated was Duane's concerted campaigning in favor of the East India Company's army personnel and platforming its officers and their grudges against the company higher officials. Broadly speaking, as John Shore understood it, the free press could not be reconciled with the political aims and ambitions of the East India Company. Duane's deportation was to serve as a warning to the growing tribe of newspaper editors. However, like William Bolts, who we met in episode 2, William Duane proved difficult to deport. He wrote letters to the company officials to give him more time to attend to financial matters. He had also taken in his care 3 orphans who were children of a deceased friend. He wanted time to see to their affairs and care as well. When soldiers arrived to arrest Duane on June 2, 1794, he was nowhere to be found. He had gone into hiding. To coax him out into the open, the government said that they would defer his deportation to July 18th. Later, after yet another round of pleading via letters, the deportation was deferred to whenever the next Indiaman sailed for Europe. By November, he received another notice asking him to prepare himself for deportation. He only replied to it by the end of November and asked for another 4 months. Shore was not playing. He said no.
So Duane escalated the matter. On December 26, 1794, he wrote a letter to Shore's secretary, saying if he didn't get an audience with the Governor-General, he would print an inflammatory address to the East India Company's army in his paper. He said he had it all written down. If he got to speak to John Shore, he wouldn't print it. However, he had already turned his inflammatory address into a pamphlet which was circulated widely. The last issue of the Indian World carried these lines from William Duane. Englishmen, I have experienced the blessing of liberty in your country, and for a time I wished to be one of you. By all who knew me, I shall be received with esteem when I arrive there again. I return without disgrace. I trust in God I shall find them free, that I may forget that slavery exists anywhere. Duane was essentially saying he was no longer an Englishman after the way he had been treated, which he thought of as unjust until the day he died. He had seceded from England in spirit. Governor-General Shore knew about the pamphlet and granted William Duane an audience on December 27, 1794. Duane arrived at Government House where John Shore waited with his secretary. As he walked towards an unsmiling Shore, he was suddenly stopped by one Captain Collins. Duane was taken aback. Captain Collins informed Duane that he would be committed to Fort William as a prisoner. Before Duane could take in the words, Captain Collins dramatically stamped one foot and 30 sepoys with naked bayonets sprang into action and surrounded Duane. In early January 1795, Duane was put on board a sloop which carried him to a warship called the William Pitt. He was locked into a small 6-foot by 6-foot cabin below deck. It would take him 5 months to reach England. Unlike James Augustus Hickey, who was destroyed professionally and personally because of his journalism and died heartbroken and penniless, Duane would go on to have an illustrious career as a journalist and editor in America. In fact, he even became a colonel in the US Army. One of the things that we found while researching Duane was that he was also one of the original protesters against the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, which current US President Donald Trump has recently invoked to deport migrants. William Duane's deportation from India, however, was not a singular event. Between 1795 and 1800, several newspaper editors would face deportation from India for minor perceived transgressions. On its part, the East India Company could never make peace with having its secrets leaked to the public by the early press. By 1786, they had decided that the best way to counter maverick self-styled journalists was to enable and support publications that could be kinder, gentler, and publish the company's ads for free. The East India Company, in some ways, invented the idea that the modern press could function as an effective propaganda machine for the state. Thus was born the tension between the press as a champion of the public's voice versus the press as an arm of the state. This tension was going to come to a head as the 1800s dawned on India.
These early efforts at muzzling the press were not limited to Bengal alone. By 1795, various forms of informal censorship were being introduced either as one-off orders to particular papers for something they had printed, or by deporting particular editors. In 1795, when one Mr. Humphreys started the India Herald at Madras, he did not have a license to publish. He was censured for publishing libelous words about the government and the Prince of Wales. That was not nearly enough. He was also arrested and deported, but reportedly escaped from the ship. In March 1795, the editor of the Madras News was deported by Lord Hobart, the governor of Madras, for circulating democratic opinions that might affect the army. His words. That same year, the editor of the Madras Gazette was prohibited from publishing copies of the general orders of the government until they had been submitted for the inspection of the military secretary. In September 1796, Mr. Hornsley, editor of the Calcutta Gazette, was also warned by the government. By 1799, free postage facilities were withdrawn from the main Madras newspapers. Although after protest, the government agreed to the levy of the prescribed fees on delivery. The situation was similar in the Bombay Presidency. This presidency had seen the birth of its first newspaper in 1789. This was the Bombay Herald. In 1790, the Bombay Courier was founded by Luke Ashburner, who was an alderman of the Mayor's Court in Bombay. In 1791, the Bombay Gazette appeared, and just a few months after its publication, this newspaper was in trouble. The paper had criticized the state of the police in Bombay, and so the government asked the editor to send proof sheets to the secretary so that they could be inspected before publication. While all this was happening, the editor of the Bombay Gazette asked the government to officially authorize his paper. The government agreed, and this is how the Bombay Gazette came to be known as the government paper. This pattern of asking the government to exclusively patronize a newspaper was how some newspapers were able to survive financially. However, we must weigh this against the troubling aspect of this early newspaper industry in India. They still did not really represent or talk about the land they were operating in. Like we have said repeatedly in our previous episodes, Indians were a residual category in these newspapers. Also, editors being deported or warned for minor instances of libel was becoming increasingly common. For instance, there is the case of Holt McKinley, the editor of the Telegraph, who in 1796 angered the authorities by printing a disclosure on an officer who had extorted an excessive discount on the exchange of gold mohurs for silver. He was asked to furnish an explanation. That very year, the editor of the Calcutta Gazette was also censured for making references to certain communications that had passed between the East India Company, the Court of Directors, and the French Republic. The editor of this publication, Mr. Hornsley, asked to be pardoned and promised to refrain from publishing such articles in the future.
On the other hand, there were stories of men like James Augustus Hickey and William Duane, who were trying their best to turn newspapers into spaces for the criticism of the powerful, which they felt was very much needed. William Duane, following in the footsteps of James Augustus Hickey, had already shown how effective a paper could be when it was fashioned into a republic of letters. As the freed thoughts of its letter writers flowed in the pages of the Indian world, what was growing in the British presidencies of India were the very foundational principles of modern democracy. The idea that the voice of the people mattered and could be powerful in checking the unbridled power of the company's undemocratic rule was coming to fruition. Between 1780 and 1795, when William Duane was deported from India, the company's censorship had been piecemeal and informal. If someone raised an objection that the company's officials found credible, a newspaper would be censured or the editor deported. This was easy when you could count the number of newspapers in existence on your fingers. But by 1795, newspapers had become lucrative businesses, and not every newspaper editor thought that they could live in the East India Company's pocket. The time was ripe for the company to start enacting sterner measures. It is in this scenario that Richard Wellesley came in as Governor General of Bengal in 1798. Barely a year into his tenure as Governor General, Wellesley wrote a letter bearing an order to Sir Alured Clarke to deport yet another editor from India. Wellesley wrote, "If you cannot tranquilize the editor of this and other mischievous publications, be so good as to suppress their papers by force and send their persons to Europe." How many editors were tranquilized? How many papers were suppressed by force? How did an informal system of censorship of editors and newspapers become a solid law? Did the colonial Indian press ever fight back? All that and more next time on Reality Scribes.
We would like to thank Dr. Ritika Prasad for sharing her time and invaluable insights that helped shape this podcast. You will hear from her in our future episodes as well. Reality Scribes has been conceptualized, scripted, narrated and produced by Vasundhara Sirnet and me, Sumit Chaturvedi. All source material used in this episode can be found in the description below. The views expressed by guests on the podcast are their own and do not always reflect the opinions of Reality Scribes or the podcast hosts. You can listen to Reality Scribes on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Don't forget to like, share, and comment, and do subscribe to our channel. Also click the bell icon for notifications for when we drop a new episode. You can follow us on social media at Reality Scribes on X, Instagram, Facebook, and Patreon. You can also email us your questions and comments at realityscribes@gmail.com for a chance to be featured on our podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time.